The pagans, by the way, thought this was hilarious. They regularly made fun of Muhammad for believing everything he heard, so they called him the ear. Let's read a passage from Ibn Ishaq about Muhammad and one of his critics, a man named Nabtal. I have heard that it was of him that the apostle said, "Whoever wants to see Satan, let him take a look at Nabtal bin al-Harith. He was a sturdy black man with long flowing hair, inflamed eyes, and dark ruddy cheeks. He used to come and talk to the apostle and listen to him, and then carry what he had said to the hypocrites. It was he who said, 'Muhammad is all ears. If anyone tells him anything, he believes it.'" God sent down concerning him, in Surah 9, verse 61 of the Quran, "And of them are those who annoy the prophet and say, 'He is all ears.' Say, 'Good ears for you. He believes in God and trusts the believers and is a mercy for those of you who believe. And those who annoy the apostle of God, for them is a painful punishment." So the pagans could tell that Muhammad was simply adopting stories and practices for Islamic purposes. Not surprisingly, the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage to Mecca, is saturated in paganism and idolatry. During the Hajj, Muslims walk circles around the Kaaba, the cubical shrine that they pray to. They kiss the black stone. They run back and forth between the hills of Safa and Marwa, and so on. Where did they get these practices? Before Muhammad conquered Mecca, the Kaaba was a center of pagan worship in Arabia. The Kaaba was surrounded by 360 pagan idols. Sahih al-Bukhari, 2478. Narrated Abdullah bin Masud, the Prophet entered Mecca, and at that time there were 360 idols around the Kaaba. He started stabbing the idols with a stick he had in his hand and reciting, "And say, truth, i.e. Islamic monotheism or this Quran or jihad against polytheists, has come, and batil, falsehood, i.e. Satan or polytheism, has vanished." This is when Muhammad took control of the Kaaba. But why would he want to take control of a pagan temple and make it the center of Islamic worship? Let's back up a bit. When Muhammad and his followers were in Mecca years earlier, they prayed facing Jerusalem. The pagans prayed facing the Kaaba. Muslims prayed facing Jerusalem like the Jews. You could line up the Kaaba and Jerusalem if you wanted so that you were facing both. But the Qibla, the direction of prayer, was Jerusalem. When Muhammad was in Mecca, he really thought that the Jews were going to accept him as a prophet. The Muslim community eventually moved to Medina, and the Jews could tell immediately that Muhammad was a false prophet because they knew the Torah, and Muhammad only knew some stories that he had heard. He was all ears, remember. But Muhammad couldn't even get those stories right, so the Jews rejected him. And Allah said to Muhammad in Surah 2, verse 144 of the Quran, "Now shall we turn thee to a Qibla that shall please thee. Turn then thy face in the direction of the sacred mosque." So Allah's goal in telling Muslims to face the Kaaba was to please Muhammad. It's amazing how much of Islam is dedicated to pleasing the man who was receiving the revelations. Why would facing the Kaaba please Muhammad? Two reasons. One, he was sending the Jews a message. This is what you get for rejecting me. Two, Muhammad had grown up among pagans who prayed facing the Kaaba and all its idols. So praying to the Kaaba was normal for them. It felt right. But how could Muhammad justify praying towards a pagan shrine? Well, just a few verses earlier, in Surah 2, verse 127, Allah declared that the Kaaba was built by Abraham and Ishmael. Now that's interesting. If it was built by Abraham and Ishmael, why did Muslims spend more than a decade praying towards Jerusalem? Why does it seem like Muhammad is inventing this as he goes along? One of life's great mysteries. But what evidence do we have that the Kaaba was built by Abraham and Ishmael? Absolutely none, apart from the fact that Muhammad said it. That's good enough for Muslims, but it shouldn't be, because Muhammad had absolutely no clue what he was talking about, and I can prove it. Sahih al-Bukhari, 3366. Narrated Abu Dhar, I said, "O Allah's Messenger, which mosque was first built on the surface of the earth?" He said, "Al-Masjid al-Haram," at Mecca. I said, "Which was built next?" He replied, "Al-Masjid al-Aqsa," at Jerusalem. I said, "What was the period of construction between the two?" He said, 40 years. According to Muhammad, there was a 40-year gap between the construction of the Kaaba and the temple in Jerusalem. Why is this important? Well, we know when the Jerusalem temple was built. Solomon built it in the 10th century BC. That's more than 1,000 years after Abraham. If Abraham built the Kaaba, he built it more than 1,000 years before Solomon built the Jerusalem temple. But Muhammad said that they were built 40 years apart. So we need to ask our Muslim friends, where did Abraham and Ishmael get their time machine? Because if they didn't have a time machine, Muhammad was wrong, and we can't trust what he says about the construction of the Kaaba. And without Muhammad making up stories about Abraham and Ishmael and the Kaaba, the only evidence we have tells us that Muslims are bowing down to a pagan temple and taking a pilgrimage to a pagan temple and walking circles around a pagan temple. Qari 4496. Narrated Asim bin Sulaiman. I asked Anas bin Malik about As-Safa and Al-Marwa. Anas replied, we used to consider going around them a custom of the pre-Islamic period of ignorance. So when Islam came, we gave up going around them. Then Allah revealed, verily, As-Safa and Al-Marwa, 2 mountains at Mecca, are of the symbols of Allah. So it is not a sin on him who performs Hajj or Umrah, pilgrimage, of the house, the Kaaba at Mecca. Here again, the early Muslims understood that this was a pagan practice. They said that they stopped doing it when they became Muslims.
Assalamu alaikum and hello to my non-Muslim viewers. Today I'm going to be refuting what David Wood says about the Hajj and the Kaaba and the origins of the Kaaba and the origins of Hajj. So basically same David Wood who tried to kill his father with a hammer and was put into a mental hospital by his mother, says that the Prophet Muhammad just took anything that he heard before and he adopted it to Islam. So basically, when Prophet Muhammad heard the Hajj and the Hajj rituals and the Kaaba and stuff like that, he took that pre-Islamic pagan practice, which the Kaaba was a pagan temple before the rise of Islam. And during the early times of the Prophet Muhammad's preaching, he took that and he Islamicized it, and he incorporated it into his religion of Islam. So basically, David Wood is saying that the Prophet Muhammad took all these pre-Islamic practices and adopted it to become part of the religion of Islam. So when David Wood makes that argument, it's a fallacious argument, because what David Wood is doing is he's committing the fallacy of circumstantial ad hominem. What is the fallacy of circumstantial ad hominem? The fallacy of circumstantial ad hominem is someone saying that if a person has motive to make up something, then he actually made it up. It's like me going to a car salesman and saying I can't trust this car salesman because he wants to sell me that car. So David Wood commits the fallacy of circumstantial ad hominem when he says Prophet Muhammad just took all these stuff from before, or he made up Islam for his own reasons, whether it's political or personal or whatever. So David Wood commits the fallacy of circumstantial ad hominem. So, and not just him, but any critic of Islam who says the Prophet Muhammad made up the Quran or Islam for his own reasons commits the fallacy of circumstantial ad hominem. So basically, Prophet Muhammad was sincere. Prophet Muhammad was sincere, even the critics would say, even the Orientalists and Christian critics and stuff like that. If they're honest, they would say that the Prophet Muhammad was sincere. And David Wood would also admit that the Prophet Muhammad was sincere in what he was doing. So if the Prophet Muhammad was sincere, he wouldn't knowingly make up the Quran and Islam and things like that. So basically, I want to address some points he's bringing up, because I haven't seen any kind of response from other Muslim apologists when it comes to this issue, or I haven't seen any kind of satisfactory responses to this. So basically, what David Wood says is that the Prophet Muhammad just made up the story of Abraham going to the Kaaba. He basically what David Wood is implying is that there was no pre-Islamic notion or concept of Abraham and Ishmael building the Kaaba. Now, is this true? No, it isn't. First of all, the reason why that's false is because first of all, we need to go into whether the Prophet Muhammad is a descendant of Ishmael or not, because a lot of critics of Islam, like Sam Shimon, Sam the Scam Shimon, and other critics of Islam would say that the Prophet Muhammad made up his lineage, or they say that the Arabs weren't Ishmaelites, and Muhammad is not a descendant of Ishmael. So, did the Prophet Muhammad know that he was a descendant of Ishmael? And I would say yes, he did, because if you read Sahih Muslim, Volume 6, page 133, Hadith number 5938, which I'll be posting the reference below, as usual, Prophet Muhammad said that he was from the line, he was a descendant of Ishmael, he was from the line of Ishmael. So my question is, if the Prophet Muhammad was making up his lineage, if he was saying he's from Ishmael, if he was the first one who said he's from Ishmael and his clan or his tribe was not from Ishmael, or they didn't know about Ishmael, then how come there's no record of the Arabs pointing the finger at Muhammad and saying you're making up that story, you're making up your lineage from Ishmael? There's no record of that. That means that the Arabs before Islam, or at least the Prophet Muhammad's clan or tribe, believed that they were from the line of Ishmael. If you read the history of Al-Tabari, Volume 6, and again, I'll be posting the exact reference below, one of Prophet Muhammad's ancestors, in the line of his poetry, said that he was descendant from the line of Qa'ydhar. And Qa'ydhar was one of the sons of Ishmael, according to the Old Testament. So my question is, if the Prophet Muhammad was just making up his lineage, who's saying that he's from Ishmael, in reality he wasn't, then how come the Arabs didn't point the finger at Muhammad, saying that you're making up your lineage and that's not true about your clan or tribe being from the line of Ishmael? There's no record of that. You see, that means that the pre-Islamic Arabs believed, or at least Prophet Muhammad's tribe, at least his tribe, believed that they were from the line of Ishmael before Muhammad was born. Because, again, according to the history of Al-Tabari, Volume 6, one of Prophet Muhammad's ancestors in the line of his poetry said he's from the line of Qa'ydhar. And of course, Qa'ydhar was one of the sons of Ishmael, according to the Old Testament, according to the book of Genesis, 1 Chronicles, etc., etc. And again, I'll be posting the biblical references below. So then the question really arises, did the pre-Islamic, then David would say is that what evidence is there that Ishmael, or what evidence is there that Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba? Well, I looked into this, and it is true that if you read the book of Genesis, if you read the Old Testament, there's nothing about Abraham and Ishmael going to Mecca and building the Kaaba. That's true. I'm not denying that. But you have to understand that whoever wrote the Old Testament didn't know every single detail about Abraham. Whoever wrote the Old Testament, whoever wrote the book of Genesis specifically, wrote it from a Jewish point of view. They didn't write it from, they didn't write it from an Arab point of view. So basically, whoever wrote the book of Genesis probably didn't know about Abraham and Ishmael going to Mecca and building the Kaaba. That's very possible. Just because a story isn't found in the Old Testament, that doesn't mean that story is false. You see, because Jews, Christians, and Muslims believe in revelation of content. You see, so, in a world where God exists, in a world where the supernatural exists, God could have revealed the story of Abraham and Ishmael going to Mecca and building the Kaaba, when the authors of the Bible, with the authors of the Old Testament, probably didn't know that story, because it probably wasn't relevant to them, or something like that. So again, there's no one can disprove that Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba. So my theory can't be disproven by Jews and Christians, because Jews and Christians do believe in Abraham and Ishmael, according to their own scripture. The only people who can, criticize what I'm saying are atheists, because atheists, they don't even believe in the Old Testament to begin with. They don't believe in Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac, and they go as far as saying that Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael were or at least Abraham was made up and stuff like that. They'll go as far as saying that. But again, Jews, Christians, and Muslims do believe in these figures. So just because a story is found in the Islamic traditions but not found in the Judeo-Christian traditions, that doesn't mean the Islamic tradition is a myth or a legend. It's very possible that that story of Abraham and Ishmael going to Mecca and building the Kaaba was a true story, and whoever wrote the Old Testament or the book of Genesis at least didn't know about it. That's very possible. So again, I did some research and I found that the pre-Islamic Arabs did believe that Abraham and Ishmael did build the Kaaba, and this is found in Sahih Bukhari, Volume 2, Book 26, Hadith number 653, Sunan Abu Dawud, Book 10, number 1914, Sunan Abu Dawud, Book 15, number 2789, Sahih Bukhari, Volume 4, Book 55, number 570, Sahih al-Bukhari, Book 5, Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 5, Book 59, Hadith number 584, Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 3, Book 40, number 556, Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 4, Book 56, Hadith number 7110, and etc. So basically, there's several narrations, which I'll be posting the references below. So don't just take my word for it. As usual, I'll post the references below to show that I'm actually telling the truth. So basically, there was a notion before Muhammad was born, before the rise of Islam, that Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba, and this notion was held by the pre-Islamic Arabs. You see, so basically the story goes that Abraham had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael, and Hagar and Ishmael were cast out. According to the book of Genesis, and if you read the letters of Paul, it says that Mount Sinai was in Arabia, or Hagar represents Arabia, and Galatians and stuff. So Christian commentators and stuff like that proved that Hagar and Ishmael were sent to Arabia. So basically, there was this pre-Islamic notion that Hagar and Ishmael were in Arabia, were in Mecca. According to not just the Islamic literature, but according to the New Testament in the book of Galatians, where Christian commentators, again, I'll be posting the references below, say that Hagar and Ishmael were in Arabia. So, but then it is true that there's no there's no story in the Old Testament that says that Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba in Mecca. That's true. I'm not denying that. But I'm saying just because it's not found in the Old Testament doesn't mean it's a myth. Doesn't mean it's a legend or it didn't happen or anything like that. So basically, the pre-Islamic Arabs knew of Abraham. They knew of Ishmael. They believed that Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba, and they believed that they were descendants of Ishmael from the line of QAYDHAR. So that refutes David Wood's argument that Islam invented that idea of Abraham and Ishmael building the Kaaba. Then he brings up some other point about 40 years being between the building of the Kaaba and the building of the mosque in Jerusalem, or the Jewish temple. So I did some research into that, and basically what David Wood doesn't cite is he doesn't cite any kind of hadith commentary. So David Wood just doesn't know what he's talking about, because he just cites that hadith and he just leaves it at that. He doesn't check Ibn Hajar's commentary. Remember, Ibn Hajar wrote a commentary on Sahih al-Bukhari. So this is what Ibn Hajar says regarding this hadith. He says that it raises a problem, since Abraham built the Kaaba and Solomon built the Jewish temple, or Masjid al-Aqsa, if you will, according to the Arabic, and there are 1,000 years between them. So basically what Ibn Hajar says is that, that it's this that the Prophet Muhammad is not saying that Abraham was the first person to build the Kaaba. Again, remember, according to Islamic theology, Adam, who's a main figure and who's an important figure in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim sources, Adam built the Kaaba, and then later on, Abraham, according to Islamic theology, Abraham rebuilt the Kaaba. So according to Ibn Hajar, it was not Abraham who first built the Kaaba for the first time, nor is it Solomon who built the Bait al-Mosque, or the Jewish temple, for the first time. Indeed, we have narrated that the first one who built the Kaaba was Adam. So Adam was the first one who built the Kaaba. Then his progeny spread on earth. Therefore, it is possible that one of them built the Jewish temple. Later, Abraham rebuilt the Kaaba according to the Quran. Likewise, Al-Qurtubi, and Al-Qurtubi wrote a commentary on the Quran. Al-Qurtubi was a Muslim scholar, says that the hadith does not indicate that Abraham and Solomon were the first ones to build the two mosques. It was only a renovation of what had been founded by others. So basically, Abraham was not the first one who built the Kaaba. According to Islamic theology, Adam was the first one who built the Kaaba, and then Abraham later on rebuilt it. So, and again, according to Islamic theology, Solomon wasn't the first one who built the Jewish temple. Somebody else built the Jewish temple, and then Solomon rebuilt it. From its original foundations. Another possibility is that is found that Ibn Hajar cites is that God founded the house with Adam when he descended, but Adam missed the voices of the angels in their prayers. Therefore, God told him, "I've sent a house around which people will move in, and will be resolved by my throne. So set out to it." Adam set out to Mecca. He had descended in India, and his steps were enlarged until. Basically, it is also said that when he had prayed at the Kaaba, he was ordered to set out to Jerusalem, where he built a mosque and prayed therein. So it became a qibla to part of his progeny. So according to Ibn Hajar and Ibn Hisham and Ibn al-Jawazi, basically. The first person who built, one theory is that, according to Ibn Hajar, the first person to build both the Jewish temple and the Kaaba was Adam. So what probably happened is that Adam built the Kaaba first, and then 40 years later he built the Jewish temple. Or another possibility is that Abraham built the first Kaaba, or the first mosque, which is the Kaaba, and then, or he rebuilt the Kaaba. After Adam's building of the Kaaba got destroyed by whatever natural disasters or whatever, Abraham built the Kaaba, rebuilt the Kaaba, and then 40 years after Abraham died, somebody built, the Jewish temple, or a very, very primitive form. Rebuilt the Jewish temple in a very primitive form, and then later on Solomon rebuilt that Jewish temple so basically one of Abraham's descendants probably built the Jewish temple first, and then it got destroyed, and then for whatever reason, and then Solomon came and he rebuilt the temple, the Jewish temple. So regardless, there's no contradiction here, because again, all you have to do is read Ibn Hajar, or you have to do is read the Hadith commentaries to understand what this Hadith is talking about. So this Hadith is not talking about Abraham built, that there's some kind of historical mistake that Muhammad made, because what they was implying is that Abraham built the Kaaba, and then 40 years later, Solomon somehow went back in time and built the Jewish temple. No, that's not what the Hadith is saying, because, or Prophet's not saying that, because what probably happened is that Adam built the Kaaba, and then it got destroyed, and then Abraham built the Kaaba, and then 40 years after Abraham Abraham died or whatever, one of Abraham's descendants probably remade the Jewish temple, or the Jerusalem temple, the same Jerusalem temple that Adam originally built. So that's another, but that's one possibility. The other possibility is that Adam built the Kaaba first, and 40 years after he built the Kaaba, um, uh, he went to Jerusalem and he built a very early form of the temple, the temple of the Jerusalem temple, which is much of the Baitul Mosque or whatever. So basically, there's no contradiction. There's no contradiction here. But again, if you read that hadith, nowhere does that hadith say that Abraham was the first one to build the Kaaba, and nowhere does that hadith say Solomon was the first one to build the Jewish temple. These structures were built according to Islamic theology, according to Islamic theologians and scholars. The first people to build uh, the Kaaba and the Jewish temple was probably Adam. And then when those structures got destroyed, when those primitive structures got destroyed, Abraham rebuilt the Kaaba, and then probably 40 years after Abraham, one of Abraham's descendants first rebuilt the Jewish temple from where Adam built the Jewish temple. So that's very possible. But regardless, there's no contradiction in that hadith, according to what the Muslim scholars say about it. So basically, then David Wood states that what about the pagan rituals in Islam, that the Prophet Muhammad just took these pagan rituals, that the Kaaba was a pagan temple and things like that. That's true. I'm not denying that, but you have to understand that that basically the descendants of Ishmael were introduced paganism or idolatry to the Kaaba, um, to the to the Hajj rituals and stuff like that. If you read this book, I have this book right here called The Prophetic Biography by Sirah Ibn Hisham, and Ibn Hisham was an important Sirah writer or biographer of the Prophet Muhammad, where he says that the first person that the first descendant of Ishmael to introduce the Arabs to polytheism or idolatry was someone named Amr bin Luhay, where he says that, and again, let me read the passage here. Um, According to Ibn Hisham, there was a person dragging his intestines in the fire of hell, and I fear the resemblance of. He was the first to change. So, according to Ibn Hisham, the Prophet Muhammad said he was the first to change the religion of Ishmael. Thereupon, he set up the idols around the Kaaba and invented such animals as Bahir, Shafia, Wasim, and Ham. And again, this is according to Ibn Hisham. So basically, the first person to introduce idolatry or paganism into the Kaaba and into the Hajj was somebody named Amr bin Luhay, who was one of the descendants of Ishmael through the line of QAYDHAR. And again, stones. It says stones were first worshipped by the descendants of Ishmael. So paganism or I'm sorry, idolatry, and these pagan rituals and stuff like that weren't introduced by Abraham and Ishmael. They were introduced by the descendants of Ishmael. And again, you can. This is found in Ibn Hisham, the Prophetic Biography. This book right here, page 60, where it talks about how idolatry was introduced into the Kaaba and things like that. And again, you can read this in the tafsir or the commentary of Ibn Abbas, Mujahid, Qatada, and tafsir Al-Tabari. So basically, from the descendants of Ishmael, there were people like the descendants of Ishmael introduced the idols and pagan rituals into the Kaaba. It wasn't Abraham and Ishmael who introduced. It wasn't Abraham and Ishmael who were paganistic. No, Allah taught Prophet Muhammad, or Allah taught Abraham and Ishmael, these rites and rituals of the Kaaba, and then generation after generation, they forgot about Abraham and Ishmael, and they introduced, the worship of idols and, pagan rituals into the Kaaba and the Hajj and things like that. So basically, what Islam does, or what Islam does, is it brings back to the original rights of Abraham and Ishmael. Then they would say something about Safa and Marwa, where he says that, that that the story that the running of Safa and Marwa was a pagan ritual and things like that. But again, you have to, if you read the Quran, verses, Allah is revealing that that the ritual of Safa and Marwa were actually monotheistic, or they were pure. And then the Arabs later on paganized it and whatever. But basically, the disciples or the companions of the Prophet Muhammad probably didn't know about the rituals of Safa and Marwa, and Allah is just revealing, or Allah is telling the Prophet Muhammad that those rituals are okay because those rituals were done by Abraham and Ishmael anyways. So there's nothing pagan about that. So basically, there's nothing pagan about the Hajj and stuff like that. It's true that before Islam, Mecca or Kaaba was a pre-Islamic temple and there were idols in there, sure, but that was done by the Arabs. That wasn't done by the Prophet Muhammad. Never promoted polytheism and paganism. In fact, Prophet Muhammad hated polytheism and paganism. When he went to the Kaaba, he destroyed the idols in the Kaaba. So does that sound like Prophet Muhammad was promoting, pre-Islamic Hajj, pre-Islamic pagan Hajj rituals? No, he was completely against it, because the Prophet Muhammad was sincere, and Prophet Muhammad believed that Abraham and Ishmael ran around the Kaaba. They were doing stuff against they were circling around Safa and Marwa, etc., etc. So again, we have to read everything in its proper context. So basically, that story. So basically, David would just makes up stuff where he's not telling you the full picture as usual. Because why would he? He doesn't further his agenda or whatever his propaganda is. So basically, in review, Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba and they did the rituals and stuff like that, and then later on generations forgot about it and introduced paganism and idolatry and things like that into the Hajj and into the Kaaba and things like that. So and again, and another polemic is that people didn't know about the Kaaba. The Kaaba didn't exist and the Hajj didn't exist until the 4th century or things like the 3rd century and things like that. And that's actually false, because we do have mention of the Kaaba in Mecca and stuff like that in the 1st century. There was a historian that mentioned the Kaaba and things like that in Mecca in the 1st century AD. So basically, there was people knew about the Kaaba in Mecca before the rise of Islam, before the birth of Prophet Muhammad. Like 100 years before Jesus, there was a historian who talked about Mecca and the Kaaba and things like that. So basically, this whole just David Wood is not telling the truth about the Kaaba and Hajj and stuff like that. Basically, Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba according to pre-Islamic notions, according to pre-Islamic beliefs and things like that. And and Islam doesn't claim to bring everything new with it. There are some rituals and there are some stories that Islam adopted, that Islam claims was known. So it's possible that the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad were revealing true stories which weren't found in the Old and New Testaments. That's very true, because again, not every single thing is recorded in the Old and New Testaments about David, Solomon, Abraham, Jesus, and stuff like that. So it's very true. It's very possible that there were true stories about Jesus and Abraham and Ishmael found in the Quran, which didn't make it into the Old and New Testaments. That's very possible. That's not impossible. That's very possible. Because again, the Quran, or I'm sorry, the Old Testament and New Testament doesn't record like every single day and every single second and every single event in the life of Abraham, Ishmael, Solomon, David, Jesus, um, the disciples. It doesn't record every single like event. It's possible. It's very possible that whoever wrote the Old Testament and New Testaments um, didn't know like certain stories or certain events in Jesus' life or Abraham and Isaac's life, and the Quran is just confirming these unknown stories or these forgotten stories or these stories that didn't make it into the Old and New Testament for whatever reasons. So basically, my theory can't be refuted by Jews and Christians because, again, Jews and Christians believe in revelation of known content and revelation of unknown content. So this is probably revelation of unknown content before. Because, again, if you read the Old Testament and New Testament, not every single major event, the Bible doesn't record every single detail or every single minute or every single second of the lives of Abraham, Ishmael, and Jesus. It doesn't do that. So, it's possible that that God is revealing these unknown stories, into the Quran, that the authors of the Old and New Testaments didn't know about. That's very possible. In a world where God exists, in a world where the supernatural exists, this is certainly possible. But again, David Wood brings up an interesting point because he says that Muhammad just took anything he heard before and he adopted it to Islam. Exactly. So this notion of Abraham and Ishmael building the Kaaba was already a pre-Islamic notion. It was a pre-Islamic belief. Prophet Muhammad just didn't make it up out of the blue. It was already there in pre-Islamic Arabia. So again, Islam doesn't claim to bring everything new with it. So these stories or these traditions that the Prophet Muhammad knew. The Quran in Islam is basically confirming that yeah, these are true stories. So that basically refutes that point. Again, again, he brings up another story found in this book, Ibn Ishaq, where it says the Prophet Muhammad was all ears. Um, you know, when Naql ibn Harith says that Prophet Muhammad was all ears, and the Meccans would make fun of Prophet Muhammad for being gullible and hearing these things and things like that. Well, again, I checked the authenticity of that story, and that story's not. There's no reliable chain of transmission for that story. So that story is probably not authentic. Because I can't find any kind of reliable chain of transmission. But again, notice what David Wood says. David Wood says that Prophet Muhammad is all ears. So if Prophet Muhammad is all ears, then he got the story of Abraham and Ishmael from these pre-Islamic Arabs, because according to this book, The Life of Muhammad by Ibn Ishaq, translated by Ehteshaam Gulam, according to this book, Prophet Muhammad is all ears. So if Prophet Muhammad is all ears, if Prophet Muhammad is just hearing all these things, all these pre-Islamic stories about Abraham and Ishmael, then that means that the stories of Abraham and Ishmael were Abraham and Ishmael building the Kaaba and the Arabs being descendants of Ishmael was a pre-Islamic notion anyways. The Prophet Muhammad didn't make it up. So because there was a pre-Islamic notion that Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba, there was a pre-Islamic notion that the Arabs were descendants of Ishmael. So if the Prophet Muhammad was making up the stories of Abraham and Ishmael building the Kaaba, and Prophet Muhammad was making up the story of the Arabs being descendants of Ishmael, or at least Prophet Muhammad's tribe being the descendants of Ishmael, then the Arabs would have pointed the finger at the Prophet Muhammad say that you're making up the stories of the origins of the Kaaba, you're making up the stories of our lineage, because we didn't know about Abraham and Ishmael building the Kaaba before you arrived, or we didn't know about Ishmael being our ancestor before you. So that means that David Wood is actually helping prove my point that that there was a pre-Islamic notion, or there's pre-Islamic belief that Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba, because if the Prophet Muhammad was just making this up out of the blue, out of nowhere, then the Arabs would have pointed fingers at him, saying that you're making up the story. But there's no tradition of the Arabs pointing the finger at the Prophet Muhammad, saying that you're making up the story of Abraham and Ishmael building the Kaaba. That means that there was a pre-Islamic notion, or there was a pre-Islamic belief that Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba, and there was a pre-Islamic belief that Ishmael was the descent, or Ishmael was the ancestor of the Arabs. So, because again, the Prophet Muhammad said that he was a descendant of Ishmael, found in Sahih Muslim, volume 6, page 33, hadith number 5938. So if the Prophet Muhammad was really making up the story, making up his lineage or making up his ancestry to Ishmael, then the Arabs would have definitely pointed it out to them. Because again, if you read the Quran, if you read various places in the Quran and stuff like that, the Arabs and the Jews would criticize Muhammad. They would make fun of Muhammad, or they would criticize the Prophet Muhammad. For example, the Quran chapter 25 and things like that say, the Arabs would say the stories of the Quran are nothing but tales of the ancients. In the Quran chapter 2 verse 13, the Jews would say that the only people who follow Muhammad are the fools. Why should we believe as the fools believe? That means that the Jews would make fun of the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad, or they would make fun of the early Muslims, saying that these were foolish people and stuff like that. But my point is that the Arabs and Jews used to criticize the Prophet Muhammad. They weren't shy of criticizing the Prophet Muhammad, or making fun of the Prophet Muhammad, or challenging the Prophet Muhammad's prophethood and stuff like that. There is no record of Arabs or Jews saying that the Prophet Muhammad is making up the story of Abraham and Ishmael building the Kaaba, and there's no record of the Arabs saying the Prophet Muhammad is making up the lineage, or making fun of Prophet Muhammad for making up the story of their lineage or their ancestry to Ishmael. What that means is that since there's no record of Arabs and Jews criticizing the Prophet Muhammad about Abraham and Ishmael building the Kaaba, and Ishmael being the ancestor of the Arabs, that means that the tradition of Abraham and Ishmael building the Kaaba and Ishmael being the ancestor of the Arabs was a pre-Islamic belief. Before Muhammad was even born, the Arabs in Arabia believed that Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba, and they were descendants of Ishmael. So this actually helps prove my case, or it helps prove my theory. So that's all I wanted to say about the whole origins of the Kaaba and Hajj. So as usual, David Wood is not telling the whole story, or he's not telling the truth about the pre-Islamic origins of the Kaaba, and the pre-Islamic Abrahamic tradition of the Hajj rituals. Thanks.